What kind of place forces 5 women to choose disappearance over prayer, silence over safety, and exile over faith? And what kind of truth stays buried for 28 years before finally demanding air? For most of the world, our names vanished on a storm-soaked September night in 1979, swallowed by rumors that said we were dead, or reckless, or corrupted. But none of those stories ever came close to the truth, because the truth was never convenient, never clean, and never something people wanted to hear. I am Grace, 70 years old now, my hair thin and my hands marked by time, and today I am no longer willing to carry the weight of a silence that was never meant to protect the innocent. I want you to imagine what it feels like to wake up every day knowing that the place you trusted with your soul is the very place that taught you fear. Because that is where this story truly begins, not on the night we ran, but long before, when belief still felt safe. I entered the convent at 16, quiet by nature, observant rather than outspoken, drawn not by escape but by devotion, by a longing to belong to something sacred and ordered, something untouched by the cruelty of the outside world, and for a time it was exactly that. The days followed a rhythm that soothed the mind, bells marking prayer, work giving purpose, silence offering space to think, and the other sisters becoming family in a way blood never had. We were only 5, bound not by coincidence but by shared conviction, living in a small convent perched above a town that saw us as symbols of peace, and we believed them because we wanted to believe ourselves. There was Sister Martha, whose hands baked bread that fed half the town, Sister Eleanor, whose sharp mind treated knowledge as worship, Sister Joy, whose laughter filled every room she entered, and young Sister Sarah, barely more than a girl, gentle and shy, still learning how to inhabit the life she had chosen. Above us stood Mother Agnes, firm and disciplined, but fair, a woman who believed deeply that faith required structure and structure required obedience, and under her watch we felt protected. Havenwood itself seemed designed to cradle belief, a place where everyone knew your name, where the convent bell was as familiar as the church clock, where trust was assumed and questioned rarely, if ever. That is why what happened next was so devastating, because it did not arrive as a storm, but as a whisper, subtle enough to be ignored, quiet enough to be doubted, dangerous precisely because it hid behind authority. When Father Michael arrived to replace our longtime spiritual guide, he came with a presence that commanded attention, a voice that filled the chapel, and a reputation that preceded him. And at first, no one questioned anything, because why would they? He wore the right cloth, spoke the right words, and knew exactly how to present himself as a man of God. But there are moments when the body knows what the mind refuses to accept, and from the beginning, something in me recoiled, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently, a tightening in the chest, a sense that the air changed when he entered a room. At first, it was easy to dismiss, because doubt feels sinful when it points upward, because questioning authority is framed as weakness of faith, because everyone else seemed impressed, and I told myself that my unease was nothing more than imagination. But patterns reveal themselves to those who watch, and I have always watched. His visits became frequent, his interest personal, his questions during confession lingered too long on things that felt invasive rather than spiritual, and his touch, always brief, always justifiable, never crossed a line openly, which made it harder to name, harder to challenge, harder to explain. You begin to doubt yourself in moments like that, telling yourself you are overreacting, that holiness cannot coexist with harm, that if something were wrong, someone else would notice too. But someone else did notice, even if she didn't have the words for it yet. I saw it in the way Sarah avoided being alone, in the way Joy's laughter faltered, in the way silence crept into places it had never lived before, and still, none of us spoke, because silence is what fear teaches first. The convent, once filled with warmth, slowly grew tense, conversations shortening, glances becoming cautious, and when Mother Agnes fell gravely ill and was confined to her bed, the last layer of protection we didn't even realize we depended on disappeared. That was when the shadow stopped pretending to be a trick of light. Authority, when unchecked, grows bold, and Father Michael's presence increased, justified by concern, by duty, by spiritual oversight, and without Mother Agnes standing between us and him, the balance shifted in ways we did not yet fully understand. I remember the first moment that shattered any illusion I had left, the moment that still returns to me in fragments, because some memories refuse to stay whole. The sight of Sarah cornered in the library, fear etched across her face, his grip on her wrist tight enough to leave no doubt. And in that instant, belief collapsed into certainty. That night, sleep did not come, because once you see the truth, you cannot unsee it, and once you understand that evil does not always arrive with horns, but sometimes with blessings, you realize how unprepared you are for what comes next. I tried to find an ally, to speak in fragments, to test the waters without naming the storm, and what I found instead was the same fear reflected back at me, the same paralysis, the same unspoken understanding that to accuse a priest was to invite disbelief, punishment, and isolation. Yet something inside me shifted, because faith that demands silence in the face of harm is not faith at all. And deep down, I knew that whatever awaited us, remaining still was no longer an option. What I did not yet know was how high the cost would be, how far silence could stretch, or how one decision would force us to abandon everything we had ever known, because the night we chose to run was not born of panic, but of the slow realization that staying would destroy us all. And if you think that was the most terrifying moment of this story, understand this: the escape was not the beginning of our suffering, it was only the moment we stopped pretending we were safe, because what happened next would follow us for decades, and the first price was learning just how powerful silence can be when it is used as a weapon. What if the place you trusted most didn't change overnight, but slowly, so slowly that by the time you realized something was wrong, it already owned your fear? Before anyone ever whispered the word danger, before suspicion took shape, our lives inside the convent were defined by a rhythm so steady it felt eternal, and that constancy is what made everything that followed so disorienting. Each morning began before dawn, the bell cutting cleanly through sleep, calling us not just to wake but to remember why we were there. And in those early hours, when fog wrapped the hill and the chapel candles flickered against stone walls, faith felt tangible, almost warm. We prayed together, not as individuals but as one breath, one intention, believing that devotion was strongest when shared. And after prayer, we worked, because work was worship in its own quiet way. I tended the garden, hands in the soil, finding peace in the predictability of growth, the way seeds obeyed natural law, sprouting when given care, reminding me that patience was rewarded. Sister Martha ruled the kitchen like a sanctuary, flour dusting her sleeves, ovens glowing like altars, her bread feeding bodies and spirits alike. And when she said that nourishing others was the highest form of prayer, we believed her because her hands told the truth. Sister Alina spent hours in the library, reading, annotating, memorizing, convinced that understanding deepened faith rather than weakened it. And when she spoke, her words carried weight, not because she raised her voice, but because she chose them carefully. Sister Joy moved through the convent like light itself, laughter echoing down hallways, children from the town clinging to her skirts during catechism classes, her joy infectious, her belief simple and sincere. And then there was Sarah, still learning how to inhabit silence without being swallowed by it, young enough to trust easily, gentle enough to assume goodness. And it was perhaps that innocence that made her the most vulnerable, though none of us understood that yet. Mother Agnes presided over all of this with discipline that felt protective rather than harsh, insisting on order, on structure, on boundaries. And while she could be stern, her presence anchored us, reminding us that authority, when exercised with integrity, could be a shield rather than a threat. Havenwood itself mirrored that sense of safety, a town where doors were left unlocked, where the convent was seen as a refuge, a place of moral certainty, and because the outside world trusted us, we trusted ourselves even more. That is the dangerous thing about trust. It does not prepare you for betrayal, it blinds you to it. When Father Michael first entered our lives, he did so against this backdrop of certainty, and that context matters because had we already been suspicious, had we already been guarded, perhaps things would have unfolded differently. But he arrived as an answer to prayer, filling the space left by Father Thomas, who had guided us gently for years. And though we were sad to see him go, We accepted change as part of God's plan. Father Michael's presence was commanding, his sermons eloquent, his confidence reassuring, and to the town, he appeared as everything a priest should be. He praised our work, spoke of obedience and humility, and positioned himself as a shepherd watching over a small, devoted flock. And at first, his attention felt like affirmation rather than intrusion. Yet beneath that surface, something subtle began to shift, not in any single moment dramatic enough to confront, but in accumulation, in tone, in emphasis, in the way certain glances lingered just a moment too long. Confession, once a place of relief, began to feel heavy, his questions steering toward areas that felt unnecessarily intimate, framed as spiritual guidance, but leaving behind a residue of discomfort that clung to the skin. Touches, always explainable, always brief, began to form a pattern, a hand on a shoulder held longer than needed, a step too close, a presence that crowded space without invitation. These were not actions that screamed danger, they whispered it. And whispers are easy to dismiss when you are taught that doubt itself is a failing. We told ourselves that holiness required endurance, that discomfort was a test, that our own reactions were the problem. And in doing so, we slowly surrendered the very instincts meant to protect us. I watched this happen not only within myself, but within the convent as a whole, conversations growing more guarded, laughter less frequent, and moments of shared ease replaced by a tension none of us named. Mother Agnes, still strong then, noticed some of this, but illness crept in quietly, pneumonia weakening her, confining her to bed, and as her presence faded from daily life, a subtle vacuum formed, one that authority rushed to fill. Without her steady oversight, Father Michael's visits increased, framed as concern, as duty, as care, and the convent, once governed by clear boundaries, began to feel porous, exposed. I remember thinking how strange it was that peace could erode without a single argument, how safety could unravel without a sound. And it frightened me not because of what had already happened, but because of what it suggested about how easily control could shift. Sarah grew quieter, Joy's laughter became more brittle, Elinor's questions sharper, and I felt the weight of something unnamed pressing down on us all. Yet still, we clung to routine, believing that structure would save us, that if we prayed harder, worked more diligently, obeyed more fully, the unease would pass. That belief, that persistence alone could restore balance, kept us still when movement might have saved us sooner. And it is painful now to look back and realize how thoroughly we were conditioned to doubt ourselves. The convent had not yet become a place of terror, but it was no longer a sanctuary either, and in that fragile in-between space, where fear had not fully revealed itself, but trust had already begun to crack, the groundwork was laid for everything that followed. Because when evil does not announce itself, when it waits patiently, adapting, observing, exploiting reverence and silence, it does not need force at first, only permission, and we, without realizing it, had begun to grant it. And if you think this was still the worst of it, understand this. The moment we stopped feeling safe was not the moment we decided to leave. It was the moment we realized that the rules we believed would protect us no longer applied, because the next thing I witnessed would shatter any remaining illusion that this was merely discomfort, and it would force us to confront a truth none of us were ready to face. Have you ever sensed danger before it revealed itself? That quiet warning that lives in your chest long before the mind can explain it, the kind you ignore because acknowledging it would change everything. That was how Father Michael's presence began to feel to me, not as a single moment of alarm, but as a constant pressure, subtle and persistent, like a door that no longer closed all the way. The town saw him as a blessing. The sisters spoke of his devotion, and I tried, truly tried, to align my thoughts with theirs, because when everyone around you believes someone is good, questioning that belief feels like a personal failure. Yet observation has a way of sharpening over time, and patterns do not care whether they are convenient or not. I noticed how he lingered after prayers, how his eyes followed movement rather than listening to words, how his attention always drifted toward the youngest among us, and how his voice softened not with compassion, but with something else I did not yet have the courage to name. Confession became the place where that discomfort grew roots, because what was meant to be sacred space turned slowly into interrogation, his questions steering away from faith and toward the body, the mind, the private corners of thought that should never be mined by authority. He framed it as guidance, as purification, as concern for spiritual health. And because he wore the cloth, because he spoke with certainty, it was difficult to challenge him without feeling as though you were challenging God himself. I remember leaving the confessional more burdened than when I entered, carrying shame that had not existed before, wondering if that weight was a sign of my own failing, and that doubt gnawed at me far more than any overt threat could have. Outside those walls, his behavior remained impeccable. Sermons delivered with confidence, charitable gestures praised by the town, conversations polite and controlled, and it was this duality that confused me most, because evil that hides behind consistency is far harder to confront than evil that announces itself. What unsettled me deeply was how intentional everything felt, how he seemed to measure his actions, testing limits without crossing lines that could be easily named, creating an environment where discomfort was real, but evidence was elusive. Touches that could be explained away, questions that could be justified as concern, glances that could be dismissed as imagination, all woven together into a pattern that left no bruises, no witnesses, and no certainty, except the certainty that something was wrong. I began to watch more closely, not out of suspicion at first, but out of necessity, because once your instincts awaken, they demand attention. I noticed how he arranged moments of isolation, how he would ask one sister to fetch something while ensuring another remained behind, how tasks were assigned in ways that separated rather than united us, and how those moments always involved Sarah more than anyone else. She was young, newly professed, still uncertain in her role, and her trust in authority was unshakable, which made her an easy target for manipulation disguised as mentorship. I saw the fear growing in her, not dramatic, not explosive, but quiet, the way she avoided certain corridors, the way her hands shook when his name was mentioned, the way her eyes darted toward doors when she thought she might be alone. When I asked her gently if something was wrong, she smiled too quickly and said she was just tired, and I let that answer stand, because pushing further felt dangerous, and I did not yet understand why. Joy, once so open, began to withdraw, her laughter less spontaneous, her energy dimmed, and Alina grew increasingly alert, her mind turning over details she could not quite assemble into a whole. We were all reacting to something we sensed but had not yet named, and that collective unease created a silence heavier than any spoken accusation. Mother Agnes, still ill, remained distant, unaware of the subtle shifts occurring in her absence, and Father Michael's authority grew in that vacuum, unchecked, unquestioned, and increasingly bold. The first moment that stripped away any remaining doubt came unexpectedly, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in a glimpse that should never have existed at all. I was passing the library when I heard a sound, not loud enough to draw attention, but sharp enough to cut through the stillness. And when I looked inside, I saw Sarah pressed against the bookshelf, her face pale, her body rigid, and his hand gripping her wrist with a force that left no room for misunderstanding. There was no explanation that could excuse that posture, no spiritual context that could justify that closeness, and in that instant, every whisper of doubt crystallized into truth. He released her when he noticed me, his expression composed, almost irritated, as though I had interrupted something ordinary, and Sarah fled without a word, her eyes refusing to meet mine. That image burned itself into my mind, because it confirmed what fear had been trying to tell me for weeks, that this was not a misunderstanding, not a moment of poor judgment, but a deliberate abuse of power. That night, sleep abandoned me entirely, my thoughts circling the same questions over and over. How long had this been happening? How far had it gone? And why had I waited so long to trust what I already knew? Guilt settled in alongside fear, because I realized that by doubting myself, I had left Sarah alone in something no one should ever face alone. The next morning, the convent moved as usual, bells rang, prayers were spoken, work was done, and the normalcy felt obscene, as though reality itself were complicit in maintaining the illusion. I wanted to scream, to shatter the silence, to demand answers, but I also understood the danger of acting without support, without proof, without a plan. Authority does not crumble simply because it is confronted. It retaliates, and I could feel that retaliation looming even before I spoke a word. When I finally gathered the courage to confide in Alina, I did not accuse. I described, careful and measured, watching her face as comprehension dawned slowly, painfully, and when she fell silent, I knew she saw it too. That silence was not denial, but shock, the kind that freezes the mind before it allows itself to move. What frightened me most was not her reaction, but my own realization that witnessing something wrong was only the beginning, that once truth is seen, it demands action, and action carries consequences that cannot be undone. I did not yet know what those consequences would be, but I sensed, deep in my bones, that the life we had known was already over, because from that moment on, nothing about the convent felt sacred anymore, and the man everyone trusted had revealed himself as something far more dangerous than a priest, a threat cloaked in holiness, waiting for silence to protect him. And if you think recognizing the danger was enough to stop it, understand this. Awareness did not end the nightmare. It only marked the moment we could no longer pretend it wasn't happening, because what followed would test not only our faith, but our willingness to risk everything to protect one another. What happens when you finally understand that something is wrong, but every path toward speaking out feels more dangerous than staying silent, and every instinct you have is at war with everything you have been taught to obey? After what I saw in the library, the world inside the convent shifted permanently, as if a veil had been torn away, exposing something rotten beneath the surface of routine prayers and gentle rituals. I could no longer sit through sermons without hearing the hypocrisy in every word, nor could I walk past Father Michael without feeling my body tense in ways I could not control. Because fear, once awakened, does not ask permission. I wanted answers. But more than that, I wanted certainty. Something solid enough to justify action in a place where accusations alone could ruin lives, and where the accused carried far more weight than the accuser. I began to watch not as a sister, but as a witness, noting patterns, moments, absences, and the way he engineered isolation with chilling precision. He would send one sister on an errand, invent a reason for another to stay behind, or schedule private guidance sessions under the guise of concern. And always, always, the youngest among us bore the brunt of that attention. Sarah's fear was no longer subtle. It lived openly in her posture, her voice, her reluctance to move through certain spaces alone, and yet she said nothing, because he had taught her, expertly and cruelly, that obedience was salvation and disobedience was damnation. When I finally found the courage to ask her directly what he had done, she did not answer with words at first. She cried, shoulders shaking, eyes fixed on the floor, and when she spoke, her voice was barely audible, telling me that he had warned her no one would believe her, that he spoke of hell as a consequence of disobedience, that he framed his actions as divine correction rather than violation. Hearing that shattered something inside me, because it revealed not just harm but method, a calculated use of faith itself as a weapon, turning belief into a trap. I knew then that what we faced was not a single incident, but a system of control, one designed to thrive on silence and fear. I wanted to go to Mother Agnes to demand intervention, but when I did, she dismissed my concerns with indignation, accusing me of impure thoughts, of projecting temptation where none existed, and ordering me to pray for forgiveness rather than question a priest. Her response stunned me, not because I doubted her sincerity, but because it revealed how deeply authority blinded even those who believed they were protecting us. Illness had weakened her, exhaustion clouded her judgment, and Father Michael's reputation shielded him completely, leaving me isolated and ashamed for daring to speak. From that moment on, he seemed to sense the shift, as though my awareness threatened his control, and his behavior grew bolder, more calculated, his presence heavier, his gaze sharper. Joy, who had once been all light, became another target, her laughter fading into silence, her eyes red from tears she tried desperately to hide, and when she finally broke down, confessing that he had grabbed her arm hard enough to bruise it, interrogating her about her purity under the guise of spiritual counsel, my fear transformed into something darker, something closer to rage. Watching her, reduced from strength to fragility, I realized that remaining silent was no longer neutral. It was complicity, and that realization burned. I tried to protect the others in small ways, inventing group tasks, ensuring no one was left alone, creating reasons for us to move together. But those efforts only drew attention to me, and soon whispers began to circulate that I was disobedient, rebellious, unstable. Authority, when threatened, does not confront directly at first. It undermines. And Father Michael used that tactic expertly, planting seeds of doubt in others, isolating me socially, framing my concern as defiance rather than care. When he confronted me directly, questioning my obedience, my loyalty, my mental state, I understood that words would not save us, because truth without proof is easily dismissed, especially when spoken by those without power. It was then that a leaner, quiet, and methodical finally spoke the word that would change everything. Proof, whispered late one night when fear pressed in on us from all sides. That single word carried more weight than any prayer, because it acknowledged reality as it was, not as we wished it to be. We began to document everything: dates, times, locations, behaviors, phrases, building a record in secret, knowing that discovery would mean punishment, perhaps worse. Each entry felt like an act of rebellion, but also like the only form of faith left to us, a belief that truth, if preserved, might one day matter. The risk was constant, the fear suffocating, and the sense of isolation overwhelming, but we held on to the fragile hope that if we could just survive long enough to be heard, something might change. That hope was tested when Father Michael crossed a line so severe it stripped away any remaining doubt. When Sarah came to me trembling, her habit torn, her face marked, whispering that he had demanded submission as penance, framing violation as purification. The anger that rose in me then was unlike anything I had ever felt, not loud, not explosive, but cold and focused. Because in that moment, I understood that we were no longer dealing with misunderstanding or misplaced authority, but with deliberate, systematic abuse, and that staying silent would destroy us all. I made a decision that night, one that would alter the course of our lives, to seek help beyond those walls, to take the risk of being disbelieved rather than guarantee continued harm. The next morning, under the pretense of errands, I left the convent and went straight to the regional bishop, carrying our notes like a lifeline, rehearsing every word, preparing for skepticism, and when I finally spoke, laying out the truth as clearly as I could, his response was measured, cautious, and ultimately devastating, because even as he acknowledged the seriousness of my claims, his concern focused not on our safety, but on the potential damage to the Church's image. He promised discretion, investigation, patience, and I left with a fragile sense of hope, believing that I had done the right thing within the system we were taught to trust. That hope shattered days later when Father Michael returned, furious, triumphant, whispering that God punishes liars. And a leaner told me the bishop had revealed everything, including my name, and that I was now to be transferred for insubordination and defamation. In that moment, reality struck with brutal clarity. The institution I had served would not protect us. Speaking up had made us more vulnerable. And justice, as we had imagined it, did not exist for women like us within those walls. And as I stood there, condemned for telling the truth, I understood that obedience would not save us, silence would not save us, and the only remaining option was one I had never imagined. Because if we stayed, we would be destroyed, and if we ran, at least we might survive. But the decision to flee would demand a courage we did not yet know we possessed, and that is where the story truly turns. What do you do when the very system meant to protect you decides that your suffering is an inconvenience, and your truth is a threat to its reputation? After the bishop's decision, the convent no longer felt like a place of refuge, but like a cage whose doors had quietly locked behind us, and every sound echoed with danger. Father Michael's authority solidified overnight, not because he had proven his innocence, but because power, once affirmed, becomes nearly untouchable. He moved through the convent with a confidence that bordered on triumph, his gaze lingering just long enough to remind us that he knew we were trapped, and that knowledge was more terrifying than any raised voice. I was summoned and formally informed that I would be transferred to a remote convent, framed as correction rather than punishment, my attempt to report abuse recast as rebellion and instability. And in that moment, the message was unmistakable. Obedience mattered more than safety, silence more than truth. Elinor, devastated, confronted me later, torn between fear and disappointment, believing that my decision to speak had endangered us all, and I could not entirely deny it, because retaliation had come swiftly and decisively. Yet even in her anger, I could see the same realization dawning, that the system would always side with itself, that hierarchy protected power, not people. Father Michael wasted no time exploiting this outcome, isolating us further, framing me as untrustworthy, and escalating his behavior with a boldness that made it clear he felt untouchable. Sarah's condition deteriorated rapidly, fear hollowing her out, her eyes dull, her body tense, as though she were bracing for impact at every moment, and joy withdrew almost entirely, her once vibrant presence reduced to shadows and silence. Watching them suffer while knowing I had tried, and failed, to stop it tore at me relentlessly, guilt and anger twisting together until I could barely separate them. It was then that a truth became unavoidable. Justice would not come from within these walls, and staying would only ensure further harm. The idea of escape, once unthinkable, began to surface in whispered conversations, tentative at first, because leaving was not simply walking away, it meant abandoning vows, identity, and everything we had built, and that weight pressed heavily on us all. Elinor worried about appearances, about guilt, about how the world would interpret our disappearance, and she was right to fear it, because women who run are rarely given the benefit of the doubt. Joy, bitter and exhausted, argued that guilt was already ours regardless of what we did, that shame had been forced upon us, and that hiding it behind obedience would not erase it. Sarah said very little, but her silence spoke volumes, and when Sister Martha, who had served faithfully for decades, finally spoke, her words settled the matter. She acknowledged that sometimes obedience to God requires disobedience to those who claim to speak for Him, and that protecting one another was more sacred than preserving appearances. Her resolve anchored us, because if someone who had devoted 60 years to that life could see the truth, then perhaps we were not betraying our faith after all. The decision to flee did not bring relief, it brought terror, because now we had to confront the reality of how impossible it seemed. We had no money, no contacts, no experience beyond the walls we had lived within, and the convent itself was designed to prevent exactly what we were contemplating: high walls, locked gates, isolation from the outside world. We spoke in hushed voices in the cellar, surrounded by crates and shadows, planning something we never believed we would have to plan: escape. Fear hung thick in the air, not only of being caught, but of what would happen if we failed, because failure would not simply mean punishment, it would mean complete vulnerability. We prayed, not with formal words, but with raw desperation, asking not for miracles, but for guidance, for a sign that we were not alone in this choice. That sign came in the most unexpected form, through a man who delivered vegetables to the convent, quiet, unassuming, someone we had barely noticed beyond polite greetings. One afternoon, as I helped him unload crates, he looked at me with an expression that startled me: concern, recognition, and when he spoke, it was not with suspicion, but with empathy. He said he sensed something was wrong, that his late wife had always claimed he could recognize trouble, and that if we ever needed help, he would offer it without questions. His words sent my heart racing, because help, when you are desperate, can feel as dangerous as threat, and yet something in his eyes told me he understood more than he said. Days later, in a quiet exchange hidden among the vegetables, he revealed why his daughter had once been in a convent, had suffered under a priest, and had never recovered. And by the time he learned the truth, it was too late to save her. That shared pain forged an immediate bond, and with it, a fragile lifeline. He became our ally, passing messages discreetly, mapping the weak points in the convent walls, offering resources he could barely spare, driven not by obligation, but by grief and determination that no one else should endure what his daughter had. The plan took shape slowly, carefully, because haste would mean disaster, and each step carried the risk of discovery. We gathered what little we could: documents, simple clothes, necessities, knowing we would have to leave everything else behind, including symbols of the life we had once cherished. The weight of that loss pressed heavily on me, because even as we prepared to run, I mourned the faith, the community, and the innocence that had been stolen from us. The closer the appointed night drew, the more fear tightened its grip, doubts resurfacing, questions haunting us. What if we were wrong? What if we were discovered? What if running made us complicit in our own erasure? Yet every time doubt threatened to stop us, the memory of Sarah's fear, Joy's bruises, and the bishop's dismissal hardened my resolve. Because staying would not restore what was broken, it would only deepen the wounds. The night before we planned to leave, sleep eluded me entirely, my mind cycling through everything we were about to lose and everything we might gain. And in that restless darkness, I understood that faith was no longer about obedience, but about courage, about choosing life over submission. When the message finally came, simple and decisive, "Tonight at midnight, it will rain," my heart pounded with a mixture of terror and resolve, because rain would mask our movement, blur our tracks, and cloak our escape in chaos. We were running not toward certainty, but away from destruction, and that difference mattered more than I could have imagined. Because what awaited us beyond those walls was unknown. But what awaited us if we stayed was all too clear. And the next time the convent bell rang, it would not be calling us to prayer, but marking the final hours of a life we would never return to. What kind of fear forces you to prepare for freedom as if it were a crime? And what kind of courage does it take to undress your old life, knowing you may never put it back on again? The final day inside the convent unfolded with a cruel normalcy that made every moment feel unreal, as though the walls themselves were conspiring to pretend nothing was about to end. Bells rang, prayers were spoken, meals were prepared, and to anyone watching from the outside, we were still 5 obedient women moving through familiar rituals. But inside us, everything was already fractured. Each glance between us carried meaning we dared not voice. Each task felt like a farewell, and every sound made my heart jolt with the fear that someone knew, that Father Michael sensed what was coming and would stop us before we reached the wall. I remember folding laundry with shaking hands, wondering if this was the last ordinary thing I would ever do, if the simple acts I once took for granted would forever be tied to the memory of escape. As the hours passed, the weight of what we were about to do pressed down harder, not only because of the danger, but because leaving meant acknowledging that the life we had chosen with sincerity and hope had been irrevocably corrupted. We were not running from faith, no matter how it might look to the world. We were running from a man who had weaponized it. But that distinction would be lost on those who judged us from a distance. When night finally fell and the rain began as promised, heavy and relentless, it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. At midnight, when the bell struck 12, its echo swallowed by thunder, we gathered in the cellar, the place where our whispered plans had been forged. And there, in the dim light, we removed our habits, folding them carefully, reverently, because despite everything, those garments still represented a part of who we were. Placing them aside felt like shedding skin, painful and necessary. And when I looked at my sisters dressed in plain clothes, barely recognizable without the symbols of our calling, the reality of our choice settled in fully. We were no longer nuns preparing for prayer, we were women preparing to flee, and that shift carried a gravity words cannot fully capture. No one spoke much, because silence had become our language, but in the quiet, I could feel the collective fear, the shared resolve, and the fragile thread of hope binding us together. We moved through the pantry and into the storm, rain soaking us instantly, the darkness swallowing the familiar outline of the convent. And for a moment, I hesitated, my hand on the cold stone, wondering if this was the last time I would ever touch the place that had once been my home. Then I thought of Sarah, of Joy, of Aliner's whispered word proof, and hesitation gave way to urgency. The wall loomed ahead, higher than it had ever seemed, shards of glass glistening where moonlight broke through clouds, and my heart pounded so loudly I feared it would betray us. Using sheets knotted together, hands slick with rain, we climbed, one by one, muscles straining, breath shallow, every second stretched taut with the fear of discovery. I went first, not because I was the bravest, but because someone had to be, and as I reached the top and swung my leg over, I felt a strange surge of defiance, as though crossing that boundary reclaimed something that had been taken from me. Joy followed, then Sarah, her small frame trembling, Alina steady despite her fear, and finally Martha, whose age made every movement a risk. And when she hesitated, exhaustion threatening to pull her back, we reached up together, refusing to leave anyone behind. That moment, suspended between inside and outside, between past and future, felt like the true test of our bond, because escape is meaningless if it is not shared. When we finally dropped down the other side and began to run, rain pounding the earth, breath burning in our lungs, I realized that fear had transformed into momentum, carrying us forward despite the terror. Mr. Miller's truck waited where he promised, engine idling, its presence a lifeline in the chaos. And as we piled in, hiding beneath a tarp, squeezing into darkness, the convent disappeared behind us, swallowed by rain and night. As the truck pulled away, I felt a surge of grief so intense it nearly broke me, grief for the life we were abandoning, for the sisters who would die under false names, for the years we would spend hiding, and for the truth that would remain buried. Yet beneath that grief was something else, a fragile sense of relief, because for the first time in months, the fear that had ruled our days loosened its grip. We did not know where we were going, how long we would have to hide, or what stories would be told about us once our absence was discovered, but we knew with certainty that staying would have destroyed us completely. As the truck bounced along the road, thunder masking our escape, I pressed my face into the damp tarp and let silent tears fall, mourning what we had lost while clinging to the knowledge that survival itself was an act of faith. That night, September 17th, 1979, marked the end of everything familiar and the beginning of a life lived in shadows. Because freedom, we would soon learn, does not arrive without cost, and escaping the convent was only the first step into a far longer exile, one that would demand new names, new lives, and a silence heavier than anything we had ever known. What happens after you escape, when the danger you fled is behind you, but the fear refuses to let go, and freedom feels just as fragile as captivity? The night swallowed us whole as the truck sped away from the convent, rain hammering the tarp above our heads, mud splashing against the tires, and every jolt of the road sending fresh waves of panic through my body. I remember clutching the edge of the wooden floor, trying to steady my breathing, convinced that at any moment headlights would appear behind us, sirens would shatter the darkness, and hands would drag us back to the place we had just defied. In those first minutes of escape, fear did not fade, it multiplied, reshaping itself into new forms: fear of being seen, fear of being followed, fear of the unknown waiting ahead. When the truck finally slowed and turned off the main road, my heart nearly stopped. But instead of confrontation, we were met with silence. A deserted barn hidden among trees, far from town, its weathered doors creaking open to offer temporary refuge. Stepping inside, soaked and shaking, the smell of hay and damp wood filled my lungs, grounding me in the reality that we had made it at least this far. Mr. Miller spoke softly, explaining that no one came here anymore, that we could rest for a few days. And when he left us with food, blankets, and a lantern, the weight of his trust pressed on me almost as heavily as the fear we carried. Alone in that barn, 5 women who had just severed themselves from their entire lives, the silence felt different from the convent's silence, less oppressive, but no less heavy, because now it carried uncertainty rather than control. Sister Martha was the first to break it, suggesting prayer, not out of obligation but gratitude. And as we held hands in a circle, surrounded by shadows, I felt something shift, a sense that faith did not belong to buildings or hierarchies, but to the fragile connections between us. Sleep came fitfully that night, broken by every sound, every imagined threat. And when dawn finally arrived, pale light filtering through cracked boards, I realized how deeply exhaustion had settled into my bones. Yet even in that fatigue, there was relief. Because for the first time in a long while, fear was no longer attached to a single man, it was diffuse, less personal, less suffocating. Morning brought coffee and quiet smiles, small gestures of normalcy that felt revolutionary, and when Mr. Miller returned with news, reality intruded again. The convent, he told us, was in uproar, our disappearance discovered, Father Michael furious, already shaping the narrative, claiming we had fled due to moral failings and rebellion. The police had been notified, searches initiated, and though no one suspected we were hiding so close, it was clear that time was limited. His words confirmed what we already knew. Escape was not a single act, but a process, and the next step required erasing ourselves completely. Plans unfolded quickly, because hesitation now would be dangerous. And Mr. Miller explained how his cousin in North Carolina could take us in temporarily, how a larger truck would transport us disguised among furniture, how we would need new names, new stories, and unwavering consistency if we were to survive. The idea of becoming someone else felt unreal, because identity is not something you expect to shed overnight. Yet here we were, forced to do exactly that. Aliner, methodical even in crisis, took charge of creating our new narrative, insisting that every detail align, because a single inconsistency could expose us. We rehearsed our story like a prayer, sisters and cousins displaced by a flood, seeking work and stability, and as we repeated those words, I felt my own name begin to loosen its grip on me. When Mr. Miller brought civilian clothes, the transformation became tangible, and putting them on felt like stepping into a life that did not belong to me, the fabric strange against my skin after years of habit and simplicity. I barely recognized myself in the cracked mirror, and the realization that the world would now see me not as Sister Grace, but as someone else entirely, sent a shiver through me. That second night in the barn was harder in some ways than the first, because the adrenaline of escape had faded, leaving behind the raw reality of what we were doing. Questions surfaced relentlessly. Would God understand? Had we broken our vows beyond repair? Could faith survive outside the structure that had defined it for so long? Sarah voiced her fear in a whisper, asking whether God still heard us. And as I answered, telling her that faith lived within us, not within walls or garments, I realized I was speaking as much to myself as to her. The sound of engines the next morning reignited panic, but relief followed when Mr. Miller arrived with his cousin Sam, the larger truck looming like both threat and salvation. Time compressed into urgent movement, final instructions given, embraces exchanged, and as the doors of the truck closed, plunging us into darkness among boxes and furniture, I felt the full weight of what lay ahead. We were no longer simply hiding, we were leaving everything behind, not just a place, but a version of ourselves that could never return. As the truck began to move, vibrations rattling through the floor, I held Sarah's hand tightly, a leaner on my other side, and in that confined space, fear and hope coexisted in uneasy balance. The road stretched ahead, unknown and unforgiving, and I understood then that escape had not freed us from fear, it had only changed its shape, because from this moment on, survival would depend not on obedience, but on our ability to disappear convincingly, to live as ghosts in a world that believed we were either dead or damned. And as the truck carried us farther away, I sensed that the hardest part of this journey was not behind us, but just beginning, because the price of freedom would be paid in years, not hours, and the silence we were about to embrace would test us in ways we could not yet imagine. What does it feel like to wake up as someone who no longer exists? To realize that in order to survive, you must erase every trace of who you once were. The journey south passed in a blur of darkness, vibration, and fear, the truck carrying us farther from Havenwood with every mile, yet never far enough from the terror that discovery could come at any moment. Inside that sealed space, time lost meaning, measured only by the rhythm of the road and the shallow breaths we took to stay quiet, because even the sound of fear felt dangerous. I remember thinking how strange it was that freedom arrived in confinement, that the first step toward a new life required hiding among other people's possessions, reduced to cargo rather than travelers. When the truck finally stopped and the doors opened, blinding light flooded in, and for a brief moment, panic surged, until Sam's familiar voice reassured us that we had arrived safely at his cousin's inn in the mountains of North Carolina. The place was modest, isolated, and mercifully quiet, the kind of location where strangers did not ask questions and routines unfolded without scrutiny. And as we stepped inside, exhausted and disoriented, I felt the first fragile sense of safety since we had fled. Mary, Sam's wife, welcomed us without curiosity, her kindness unspoken but deeply felt, and that restraint, the refusal to demand explanations, felt like a gift more valuable than shelter itself. For the first few days, we barely spoke, our bodies recovering from shock, our minds struggling to adjust to the absence of constant vigilance. And even in sleep, fear followed us, manifesting in sudden awakenings and racing hearts. Yet as days passed, the world did not collapse, no one came for us, and slowly, the reality set in that our survival now depended on consistency, on maintaining the story we had constructed. Alina drilled us relentlessly, repeating names, relationships, histories, correcting the smallest inconsistencies, because she understood that a lie must be airtight to hold, and though it pained her to abandon truth, she knew this deception was the only shield we had. I practiced my new name until it felt almost natural, speaking it aloud, answering to it, watching it replace the identity that had defined me since adolescence, and each repetition felt like both loss and protection. Sarah struggled the most, grief and fear colliding within her, and I stayed close, reminding her that this transformation, as painful as it was, meant she could finally breathe without fear of his shadow. Life at the inn followed a gentle rhythm, chores, meals, quiet evenings, and that simplicity offered a strange kind of healing, because for the first time in months, no one demanded obedience, no one monitored our movements, and the absence of control felt like liberation even when it was tinged with anxiety. We learned quickly how to navigate the outside world, how to dress, how to speak to strangers, how to answer questions without revealing too much, and each small success built a fragile confidence. Yet beneath that progress, grief simmered, because reinvention required sacrifice, and the cost was high. We mourned the lives we had planned, the identities we had cherished, and the faith that had been entwined with those identities, questioning whether it could survive this fracture. One afternoon, as I helped Mary with linens, she took my hand and told me simply that we were safe there, that whatever we were running from would not find us. And those words, spoken without expectation, unlocked a release I had been holding back, tears spilling freely as I realized how desperately I had needed someone to believe in our right to safety without demanding proof. But safety was temporary, and we knew we could not stay hidden indefinitely, because remaining in one place for too long invited recognition, and our disappearance was already spreading through local news and church circles. When Mr. Miller returned with clippings and radio reports, the lies stung more than I expected. Descriptions of us as unstable, rebellious, morally compromised, narratives crafted to preserve authority at our expense, and reading them made my stomach twist with a mix of rage and sorrow. Those lies threatened to redefine us publicly in ways we could not contest, and yet speaking out would have exposed us completely, trapping us again in the same cycle of disbelief. Faced with that reality, we made another difficult decision: to move again, to blend into a larger city where anonymity could protect us. And with the help of Sam and Mary, new documents were quietly obtained, sealing the transformation we had begun. Holding those papers in my hands, bearing a name that was not mine, I felt the finality of our choice. Because paper, more than memory, determines how the world sees you. The move to Cleveland marked the true beginning of our lives in exile, a place where we could disappear among thousands, where no one cared where we came from as long as we worked and paid rent. Adapting was overwhelming, every task unfamiliar, every interaction charged with the fear of exposure, and yet we learned because survival demands it. Work at the garment factory was exhausting but grounding, repetitive movements offering a strange solace, because they required focus and left little room for intrusive thoughts. Slowly, routines formed, friendships remained superficial but kind, and for the first time, we supported ourselves, earning our living without reliance on the institution that had failed us. Still, fear never fully left. It lingered in every unexpected sound, every mention of church, every authoritative voice, reminding us that the past was not gone, only buried. At night, we prayed together quietly, not with formal words, but with honest ones, asking not for forgiveness, but for endurance, and in those moments, I realized that faith, stripped of structure, had become more intimate, more fragile, but also more real. We had escaped the convent, but we had not escaped the consequences, because the price of survival was invisibility, and the silence we embraced would stretch far longer than any of us could have imagined, shaping our lives in ways that would only become clear with time. What does it cost to stay hidden year after year, when survival depends on forgetting who you were, but your memories refuse to let you go? By the time Cleveland began to feel familiar, the sharp edge of fear had dulled just enough for exhaustion to take its place, the kind that seeps into the bones when vigilance never truly rests. We had learned how to exist without attracting attention, how to move through the world as ordinary women with ordinary problems. But the effort of constant performance weighed heavily, because living under false names requires relentless precision. Every introduction carried risk, every conversation demanded calculation, and even small mistakes could unravel everything we had built. We were careful, avoiding churches nearby, never discussing our past beyond the story we had rehearsed, and watching one another for signs of slip or strain, because our safety depended not just on individual caution, but on collective consistency. Work at the factory provided structure and distraction, the hum of machines filling spaces our thoughts might otherwise occupy, and there was comfort in the tangible nature of labor, because fabric responds predictably to touch in ways people do not. Yet beneath that routine, grief lingered, because reinvention does not erase loss, it simply postpones it. And as months turned into years, the weight of what we had sacrificed became harder to ignore. Sister Martha's health declined first, age and stress taking their toll, and when she suffered a stroke in the kitchen, the finality of her death struck us with brutal force. We buried her under a name that was not hers, in a ceremony stripped of the honors she deserved, and standing at that grave, I felt a fracture open inside me, because our silence had followed her into death, erasing her not just from the church that failed her, but from history itself. That loss shook us deeply, and in its aftermath, we moved again, seeking both opportunity and anonymity, accepting a transfer to Charlotte where Eleanor's competence earned her a managerial role and offered us stability. Charlotte was larger, busier, and easier to disappear into, and for a time, life settled into a fragile equilibrium, routines formed, friendships cautiously maintained, and moments of genuine laughter returned, reminding us that joy was still possible, even in exile. Yet the past remained a shadow, and every so often it resurfaced with devastating clarity. In 1994, when I saw Father Michael's face in a newspaper praised for decades of service, my body reacted before my mind could process it, nausea rising, hands trembling, because there he was, unpunished, celebrated, while we continued to live as ghosts. That discovery reopened wounds we had tried to cauterize with distance, and it ignited a new kind of pain, the realization that our silence, necessary for survival, had also allowed him to continue unchecked. Eleanor withdrew after that, her thoughts turning inward, questions of justice and consequence weighing heavily on her, and when she finally voiced her fear about the future, about aging without protection, about dying under a false name, I understood that the life we had built was not sustainable forever. Her illness came quietly at first, mistaken for something minor, until the truth emerged, advanced cancer, and with it, urgency. On her deathbed, she made me promise that one day, when it was safe, I would tell our story, that the truth could not be allowed to die with us, and that silence, though it had protected us, could not be our final legacy. Holding her hand, feeling the strength in her grip even as her body weakened, I promised, not knowing how or when, but understanding that this responsibility would shape the rest of my life. When Eleanor died, another part of our shared identity vanished, buried alongside her under a name that did not reflect the courage she had shown, and the weight of that loss pressed heavily on Joy and me. Joy's health, already fragile, deteriorated in the years that followed, her heart condition limiting her strength, and when she passed away quietly in her sleep, I felt a profound emptiness, because the sisters who had shared my escape were disappearing one by one, taking with them pieces of a truth the world had never heard. Sarah, who had married and built a family, carried her trauma differently, channeling her energy into creating a life filled with love and stability, and watching her find happiness was both a comfort and a reminder of what we had endured. As the years stretched on, I continued working, eventually opening a small sewing shop in a quiet town, choosing solitude over risk. And yet even in that relative peace, the promise I had made to Eleanor haunted me. Fear remained constant, manifesting in small ways. A tightening in the chest when a priest passed by, a surge of panic at the mention of Havenwood, and the exhausting effort of maintaining a story that was never truly mine. Guilt accompanied that fear, guilt for having escaped rather than fought, guilt for those who might have suffered after us, guilt for the sisters whose lives had ended in anonymity, and alongside it, anger, sharp and persistent, directed at the man who had caused this, and at the institution that had protected him. Over time, I began to collect information quietly, following news, tracking Father Michael's rise, noting every honor bestowed upon him, each new position, and with every article my resolve hardened, because it became increasingly clear that silence was no longer merely self-protection, it was complicity. The question of whether I had the right to speak, after so many years, after so much loss, began to consume me, because truth delayed is still truth, but it carries consequences, not only for the guilty, but for those who reveal it. I stood at a crossroads, torn between the life I had carefully built and the responsibility I could no longer ignore, knowing that whichever path I chose would exact a price. And as I weighed that choice, unaware of the catalyst that would soon force my hand, I sensed that the years of hiding were drawing to an end, because something within me, sharpened by grief and sustained by memory, was no longer willing to remain silent, even if breaking that silence meant risking everything I had left. How long can a promise stay buried before it begins to suffocate the one who carries it? And what happens when silence stops being protection and starts feeling like betrayal? After Joy's death, the world grew quieter in a way that frightened me, because the voices that once shared my memories were fading, leaving me alone with a past that refused to rest. Years passed outwardly calm, my small sewing shop becoming both livelihood and refuge, my days measured by fabric and thread, my nights by thoughts I could no longer outrun. From the outside, my life appeared settled, even peaceful, but beneath that surface, the promise I had made to Eleanor pulsed relentlessly, reminding me that survival was never meant to be the final chapter. I began to understand that silence, while it had saved us once, now carried a different cost. The cost of watching injustice stand unchallenged while those who suffered disappeared quietly. Fear still ruled many of my choices. Fear of being disbelieved, fear of retaliation, fear of dragging Sarah back into a nightmare she had worked so hard to escape. And yet alongside that fear grew something else. A steady resolve that no longer asked whether speaking was dangerous, but whether remaining silent was acceptable. I followed the news more closely. Every article about Father Michael tightening something in my chest, each promotion, each public praise feeling like a deliberate erasure of our pain. He had become a symbol of everything that had failed us, celebrated while we lived under false names, and that imbalance gnawed at me relentlessly. The weight of that injustice began to manifest physically: sleepless nights, shallow breaths, moments when my hands trembled without warning, and I realized that carrying the truth alone was slowly destroying me. It was during one of those restless nights that I finally opened the notebook Eleanor had given me years earlier, the one I had been too afraid to read, too aware that its contents would demand action. The pages, yellowed and carefully filled, detailed everything we had endured: dates, locations, behaviors, names of others who had suffered before us, and even notes indicating that authorities had been warned long before our escape. Reading those words felt like reopening a wound and finding it had never healed, because they confirmed what I had suspected but never wanted to prove: that our suffering was not an anomaly, but part of a pattern knowingly ignored. Eleanor's final message to me, written with clarity and conviction, struck deepest of all, urging me to wait for the right moment, to protect myself and Sarah, but to never let the truth die with us. That night, grief and determination collided, and I understood that the right moment was not something that would announce itself clearly. It would be something I had to choose. Still, choosing did not come easily, because fear had been my companion for decades, shaping my instincts, my caution, my silence. I wrestled with questions that had no simple answers: whether exposing the truth so long after the fact would help anyone, whether justice delayed was justice denied, whether reopening wounds was cruelty rather than courage. And yet, each time doubt threatened to stop me, memories surfaced unbidden: Sarah's fear, Joy's bruises, Alina's resolve, Martha's quiet strength. And those memories demanded more than contemplation, they demanded action. The internal struggle intensified when news reached me that Father Michael had suffered a minor stroke, a reminder of his mortality, and shortly after, that a younger priest had been assigned to assist him, someone with a reputation for integrity and openness. That detail lodged itself in my mind, unsettling and persistent, because it suggested a shift, however small, in the environment that had once silenced me completely. I began to research quietly, learning about this new priest, his background, his values, and when I discovered that his own sister had been a nun, that her faith had inspired him profoundly, something within me stirred. It felt like more than coincidence, like a door cracked open after decades of being sealed shut. And for the first time, the idea of returning to Havenwood no longer felt impossible, only terrifying. The thought of stepping back into that town, of seeing the church where everything began, sent waves of panic through me, yet it also carried a strange sense of inevitability, as though the journey I had fled so long ago was circling back to its origin. I began to prepare quietly, organizing Alina's notebook, gathering clippings, rehearsing words I might one day speak, and each small act of preparation made the decision feel more real, more irreversible. I spoke to Sarah carefully, testing the ground, respecting her boundaries, and when she made it clear she could not be involved, I accepted that, understanding that courage takes different forms, and hers was in choosing peace for her family. That acceptance clarified something essential for me, that this was my burden to carry, my voice to use, and my risk to take. The days leading up to my return were marked by a strange calm, the kind that settles in when a decision has been made, even if its outcome remains uncertain. Fear did not disappear, but it changed, becoming a companion rather than a master. And as I packed my bag, placing Alina's notebook inside, I felt the weight of years lift slightly, because for the first time, I was moving toward the truth rather than away from it. I did not know whether I would be believed, whether justice would follow, or whether I would be forced back into hiding. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity: the silence that had defined my life for 28 years could no longer continue. And as I set out to return to the place I had once escaped under cover of darkness, I understood that breaking silence would demand a different kind of courage than fleeing ever had. Because this time, there would be no wall to climb, no rain to hide me, only the strength to speak and accept whatever consequences followed. What kind of strength does it take to walk back into the place that once broke you, knowing that this time you cannot run, cannot hide, and cannot afford to be silent? The day I returned to Havenwood, my body reacted before my mind could catch up, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, my chest tight as familiar landmarks emerged from memory like ghosts summoned against my will. The town looked smaller than it had in my youth, quieter, almost harmless, and that contrast unsettled me deeply, because I knew what had been hidden beneath its calm for so long. Every street carried echoes, every corner tugged at memories I had spent decades burying, and as I approached the church, my legs nearly refused to move, because fear, even when confronted, does not vanish politely. I reminded myself that I was no longer the young woman who fled in the rain. That time had carved resilience into me whether I wanted it or not, and that I carried something now that I did not have then: proof, not just of what happened, but of survival. When I met Father John for the first time, I saw confusion flicker across his face, recognition slowly replacing it as I spoke my true name. And in that moment, the reality of my return settled fully, because there was no turning back. I told him everything, not in fragments, not softened for comfort, but clearly, methodically, recounting the years of trust, the subtle violations, the escalation, the failed attempts to report, and the escape that forced us into exile. As I spoke, I watched his reactions carefully, prepared for skepticism, bracing for dismissal, but instead I saw something else: shock giving way to anger, then grief, and finally a quiet resolve that mirrored the one I felt within myself. When I placed Alina's notebook in his hands, the weight of it seemed to silence the room, pages filled with truths that refused to be ignored, and as he read, his face drained of color, because evidence has a way of stripping away denial. He did not interrupt, did not defend, did not excuse, and when he finally looked at me, his voice broke as he apologized, not just for what had been done, but for the church's failure to protect us. That apology, simple and sincere, cracked something open inside me, because for the first time, someone within the institution acknowledged the harm without reservation. Yet apology alone was not enough, and Father John understood that, explaining carefully the steps that would need to follow, the investigation, the scrutiny, the resistance we would face from those who had invested decades in preserving Father Michael's image. Fear surged again at the thought of exposure, of public disbelief, of retaliation, but alongside it came a strange calm, because after so many years of silence, speaking the truth felt grounding rather than destabilizing. Together, we met with a bishop known for confronting abuse rather than concealing it, and when he listened to my account without interruption, then knelt before me to ask forgiveness on behalf of the church, I felt the full weight of the past shift, not erased, not healed, but finally acknowledged. He warned me honestly that justice would be imperfect. That time had protected the guilty in ways it never protected the innocent, and that the process would be painful, but he promised transparency, something I had been denied before. Word spread quickly, as it always does in small towns, and soon Havenwood buzzed with whispers, disbelief clashing with curiosity, loyalty warring with doubt. And as the story reached the community center where I agreed to speak publicly, the fear returned in full force. Standing before a crowd that included faces I recognized from my youth, I felt exposed in a way hiding had never made me feel, because now my story was no longer mine alone. It belonged to everyone listening, to everyone judging. I spoke anyway, recounting the truth with clarity and restraint, refusing to dramatize, refusing to embellish, trusting that facts carried enough weight on their own. Reactions varied sharply. Some people wept openly, others sat frozen. A few left angrily, unwilling to accept that someone they admired could be capable of such harm. And I understood then that truth does not arrive as a single revelation, but as a fracture that spreads slowly, unevenly, and painfully. In the days that followed, the response intensified, local papers publishing cautious reports, then more detailed ones as evidence surfaced, and letters arrived from strangers who had experienced similar violations, emboldened by the knowledge that someone had finally spoken. Father Michael responded predictably, denying everything, accusing me of instability, filing legal threats meant to intimidate rather than defend, and for a brief moment, fear threatened to reclaim its dominance. But this time, I was not alone, and that made all the difference, because with each new voice that came forward, the narrative shifted, no longer centered on one woman's accusation, but on a pattern too consistent to ignore. The church initiated formal proceedings, removing him from active duty while investigations continued. And though justice moved slowly, its momentum felt unstoppable, because silence had finally been broken. Still, victory did not feel triumphant. It felt heavy, because with every step forward came reminders of what had been lost. The sisters who were no longer alive to see this moment, the years stolen by fear, the lives lived under borrowed names. At night, doubts returned, questioning whether the pain I had reopened was worth it, whether peace might have been easier if I had remained silent. But each time those thoughts surfaced, I returned to Aliner's words, "Silence protects the oppressor, never the oppressed." As Havenwood struggled to reconcile its image with reality, I realized that my role in this story was changing again. No longer a fugitive, no longer just a survivor, but a witness whose voice could not be taken back. And as the investigation deepened, uncovering records that confirmed what we had long suspected, that complaints had been filed and ignored years before our escape, I knew with chilling certainty that this was bigger than us, bigger than one town, bigger than one man, because what we were exposing was not just a crime, but a culture of silence that had thrived for decades, and confronting it would demand more courage than any of us had ever imagined. Because the hardest part was still ahead, and the truth, once unleashed, was about to demand a reckoning that no one could control. What happens when the truth finally escapes the shadows and demands to be seen by everyone? not just believed in private? And how do you survive when your silence is replaced by a storm you can no longer control? Once the investigation began, my life shifted again, not into hiding this time, but into exposure, and I quickly learned that speaking the truth does not end fear, it transforms it. Havenwood became a place of tension and fracture, neighbors divided, long-held loyalties strained, and every conversation weighted with suspicion and grief. Some people avoided me entirely, crossing the street to escape eye contact, as if acknowledging me meant acknowledging something they were not ready to face, while others approached in tears, apologizing for having believed the rumors all those years ago. Their words brought a measure of validation, but they also carried an ache, because apologies cannot return what was lost. They can only mark that loss as finally seen. The investigation moved forward with a meticulous slowness that tested my patience and resolve. Interviews conducted, documents examined, and timelines reconstructed, each step reopening wounds I had spent decades trying to close. I was asked to repeat my story again and again, to relive moments I would rather forget. And with each retelling, I felt the weight of responsibility grow heavier, because now the truth was no longer just about my sisters and me. It was about every person who might have been harmed and every institution that had looked away. Father Michael's defenders grew louder as the pressure mounted, insisting that the past was being distorted, that memories fade and motives change. And those accusations stung more deeply than I expected, because they echoed the same doubts that had once silenced us. Yet this time, doubt did not stand alone. It was met with records, testimonies, and corroboration that refused to be dismissed. And slowly, the narrative began to shift. The most devastating discovery came when archived correspondence surfaced, letters written years before our escape, warning of inappropriate behavior, quietly filed away with notations that claimed the matter had been resolved internally. Holding those documents in my hands felt like confirmation and betrayal intertwined, proof that we had not imagined our suffering, and evidence that the institution had chosen containment over protection. That knowledge was both validating and crushing, because it meant that what happened to us was preventable, and that realization carried its own kind of grief. As the case gained attention beyond Havenwood, journalists arrived, their questions sharp, their interest intense, and I had to decide how much of myself I was willing to expose in the pursuit of justice. Speaking publicly meant surrendering control of my story, allowing it to be interpreted, debated, and sometimes distorted. But remaining silent now would undermine everything I had fought to bring into the light. I chose to speak carefully, deliberately, focusing on facts rather than spectacle, because I knew that truth, when presented steadily, carried a power that sensationalism could not. The backlash was swift and sometimes frightening: anonymous letters left at my door, phone calls heavy with accusation, warnings thinly veiled as concern, and on those nights, fear crept back in, whispering that perhaps I had gone too far. Yet alongside that fear came something new: solidarity, messages from women who recognized their own stories in mine, who found courage in knowing they were not alone. And that connection sustained me when doubt threatened to take hold. The church's response evolved as the evidence mounted, initial caution giving way to decisive action, and when Father Michael was formally removed from his position pending the outcome of the canonical process, I felt no triumph, only a quiet sense of gravity, because accountability, when it finally arrives, is sobering rather than celebratory. The town of Havenwood struggled publicly, community meetings held, debates unfolding, and long-standing narratives questioned. And watching that process forced me to confront a difficult truth: that justice often requires dismantling myths people depend on for comfort. Amid that upheaval, I received a visit from someone I never expected: a former sister who had remained silent for decades, her voice trembling as she asked for forgiveness, admitting she had suspected but been too afraid to speak. I listened, not with anger, but with a deep understanding of how fear can immobilize. And in that moment, I realized that healing was not about assigning blame, but about acknowledging harm collectively. As weeks turned into months, the investigation continued, and while the outcome remained uncertain, one thing was clear: The silence that had once protected abuse was broken, and that rupture could not be undone. I began to see how telling the truth had transformed not just my life, but the lives of others who now felt empowered to come forward, and that realization reshaped my understanding of purpose. The fear that had governed me for so long no longer dictated my actions, not because it disappeared, but because it was finally outweighed by meaning. Standing in the midst of controversy, scrutiny, and pain, I understood that the cost of speaking was real, but so was the cost of silence. And after 28 years, I could finally say with certainty that breaking silence, no matter how late, had been the only path toward justice, even if justice arrived imperfectly. And as the case moved toward its conclusion, I sensed that this chapter, heavy and exhausting as it was not the end of the story, but a turning point, because from the ashes of exposure, something unexpected was beginning to form, a new purpose born not from faith as I had once known it, but from the determination to ensure that no one else would ever have to choose silence to survive. What happens after the truth is spoken? When belief fractures a community and justice arrives in pieces rather than absolution? And how do you live with an ending that does not feel like an ending at all? As the investigation reached its final stages, Havenwood existed in a state of uneasy suspension, waiting for decisions that would not undo the past but would forever redefine it. Conversations became cautious, friendships strained under the weight of disagreement, and the town I once knew as simple and familiar revealed itself as a place capable of both compassion and denial in equal measure. Some people clung fiercely to the image of Father Michael they had cherished for decades, insisting that no amount of evidence could outweigh their memories, while others, confronted with documents and testimonies too consistent to ignore, struggled openly with guilt for having looked away. I learned quickly that truth does not unite immediately. It divides first, forcing people to choose between comfort and accountability, and that process is rarely gentle. The Church's formal decision, when it finally came, was announced with careful language, but its meaning was unmistakable. Father Michael was stripped of his clerical duties, removed from public ministry, and formally laicized, the sacred authority he had wielded so easily taken from him at last. For many, including me, the punishment felt incomplete, because time had shielded him from criminal prosecution, and no decree could return the years stolen from us or the sisters who did not live to see this day. Yet there was a strange gravity in watching a man once untouchable reduced to anonymity, his power dismantled piece by piece, because justice, even imperfect, has a way of reshaping the narrative. Public reaction intensified after the announcement, media coverage expanding beyond local outlets, stories emerging from other towns, other women, other institutions, all echoing the same patterns of silence and protection, and I realized that what began in a small convent had opened a door far wider than I had imagined. Letters arrived daily, some filled with gratitude and solidarity, others with hostility and disbelief, and learning to hold both without being consumed by either became its own form of discipline. The most painful messages were not the angry ones, but those from people who admitted they had known something was wrong and had chosen not to act, because fear or loyalty had felt safer than truth. Their admissions carried the same weight I had carried for years, and hearing them confirmed what I had come to understand: that abuse does not thrive in darkness alone, it thrives in collective silence. Father Michael disappeared from public view shortly after the decision, leaving Havenwood quietly, much as we had decades earlier, though his exile carried none of the vulnerability ours had. And when I learned of his departure, I felt neither triumph nor relief, only a profound sense of closure, as though a door that had been open too long had finally been shut. In the months that followed, my life began to change in ways I had not anticipated, because once the fight for truth slowed, space emerged for something else to grow. Survivors sought me out not just for validation, but for guidance, for reassurance that rebuilding was possible, and those conversations revealed a need far greater than my own story. I began to imagine a place that did not exist when we needed it, a place where women could speak without fear of disbelief, where support was not conditional, and where faith, if it was present at all, served healing rather than control. That idea took root slowly, nurtured by the same patience that had sustained me through years of hiding, and with the help of others who shared that vision, it began to take shape. The old convent building, now repurposed and stripped of its former authority, became the foundation for something entirely new. A center dedicated not to silence, but to voice, not to obedience, but to safety. Returning there under such different circumstances felt surreal. Walking through halls that once held fear and imagining them transformed into spaces of care, counseling, and advocacy. And in that transformation, I found a sense of redemption I had never expected. Sarah, who had kept her distance throughout the investigation, visited quietly one afternoon, watching from the edges, and when she finally spoke, she told me she was proud, not because I had spoken, but because I had survived, and that affirmation meant more to me than any public recognition. Over time, the town began to adjust, not forgetting, but learning to live with a more complicated truth, one that acknowledged both the harm done and the resilience that followed. I learned that justice is rarely a single event. It is an ongoing process of reckoning, repair, and responsibility, and while it does not erase pain, it can give that pain purpose. Standing at the center of that evolving work, I felt the presence of my sisters more strongly than ever, not as memories weighed down by grief, but as quiet companions guiding me forward. Their suffering had not been in vain, because it had become the catalyst for change, and that realization brought a peace I had not known was possible. And yet, even as a new chapter opened, I understood that the story was not finished, because healing, like truth, unfolds over time, and the final reckoning would not be measured by punishment alone, but by what we chose to build in the aftermath, a lesson that would carry me into the last phase of this journey, where meaning would finally replace survival as the driving force of my life. What remains after fear loosens its grip? When survival is no longer the goal in life begins to ask a different question, not how do I endure, but why am I still here? The years following the investigation unfolded quietly, almost gently, a stark contrast to the chaos that had preceded them, and for the first time since my youth, I was not reacting to danger, but choosing direction. The center we established in the old convent grew steadily, shaped by intention rather than urgency, offering counseling, legal guidance, and above all, belief to women who had learned too well what it meant to be dismissed. Walking through those halls each day, I felt the weight of history, but it no longer crushed me, because those walls, once instruments of silence, had been reclaimed as witnesses to healing. The work was demanding, emotionally and physically, but it carried a fulfillment unlike anything I had known, because it transformed pain into purpose, and that transformation gave meaning to years I had once thought were simply lost. Women came from everywhere, carrying stories both familiar and unique, and in listening to them, I learned that trauma does not diminish with time alone. It requires recognition, support, and community to soften its edges. Each story echoed pieces of my own, and yet each woman brought her own strength, reminding me that survival is not a singular narrative, but a spectrum of resilience. Sarah eventually joined the work, not as a public figure, but as a quiet presence, mentoring younger women, her calm strength offering a living example that life after trauma could include love, family, and joy. And seeing her there, whole and grounded, healed parts of me I had not realized were still broken. Father John remained committed to Havenwood, refusing advancement, choosing instead to confront the everyday realities of faith and accountability, and his presence reinforced my belief that institutions, while deeply flawed, are made of people capable of change. News of Father Michael's death reached me without ceremony, a brief notice, a quiet end to a life that had cast a long shadow, and my reaction surprised me, because it was not satisfaction or anger, but closure, a sense that the power he once held had finally dissolved. Walking through the garden one afternoon, I paused at the stone benches bearing the names of my sisters, names restored at last, and I felt their presence not as sorrow, but as peace, because their stories were no longer hidden, no longer denied. The community around the center evolved, learning to engage with uncomfortable truths, And while resistance still existed, it no longer defined the conversation, because accountability had taken root. In those moments of reflection, I understood how profoundly my understanding of faith had changed, no longer tied to obedience or hierarchy, but grounded in integrity, compassion, and the courage to question authority when it contradicts justice. Forgiveness, too, took on new meaning, not as an obligation imposed by others, but as a personal release, freeing me from carrying the anger that had once sustained me but now threatened to consume me. I forgave myself for fleeing, for hiding, for surviving in the only way I knew how. And that forgiveness allowed me to fully inhabit the life I was building rather than remain tethered to the past. As the years passed, the center's impact became measurable: hundreds, then thousands of women finding support, reclaiming their voices, and moving forward. And each success reinforced the truth that healing multiplies when it is shared. Looking back, I realized that the vows I had taken as a teenager had not been broken, but transformed, lived out not in isolation, but in service shaped by hard-won wisdom. Poverty became simplicity, chastity became respect, obedience became fidelity to conscience rather than command. And in that reframing, I found peace with the path I had chosen. The fear that had defined my life for so long no longer dictated my choices, replaced instead by a quiet confidence that truth, once spoken, continues to work long after the words fade. Standing in the center at the end of a long day, listening to the low hum of conversation, I felt gratitude rather than regret, because the journey that began in terror had led to a place of meaning I could never have imagined. Yet even in that peace, I knew that one final truth remained to be spoken, not about the past, but about the lesson it carried, because survival is not the end of the story. It is the beginning, and the final chapter would not be about what was done to us, but about what we chose to do with it. A message that would define everything I had learned, and everything I hoped others would carry forward. If everything you thought defined faith, obedience, and righteousness was taken from you, what would still remain? And who would you become when fear no longer had a voice louder than truth? Today, at 70 years old, when I look back on the long arc of my life, I no longer see it as a story of loss, but of transformation, a journey that forced me to redefine meaning at every stage. I entered the convent as a quiet 16-year-old believing holiness meant submission, that goodness lived in silence and endurance, and that suffering, if borne quietly, was somehow virtuous. It took decades, exile, and unbearable grief to understand how dangerously wrong that belief was. True faith, I have learned, does not demand silence in the face of harm. It demands courage, even when that courage costs everything familiar. The years we spent hiding were not wasted years, though I once believed they were, because survival itself was an act of resistance in a world that had tried to erase us. Each day we lived under borrowed names was proof that the abuse did not destroy us, even if it scarred us deeply. I have learned that trauma does not end when danger ends. It lingers in the body, in the breath, in the way the heart races at unexpected reminders. But healing begins the moment truth is allowed to exist openly. Watching the women who come to the center take their first steps toward reclaiming their voices reminds me daily of that truth, because fear may shape us, but it does not get the final word. Many ask me now if I still consider myself a nun, and my answer never changes, not because I cling to the past, but because I have come to understand vocation differently. I did not abandon my calling, I carried it beyond walls that could no longer hold it. Service does not require a habit, and devotion does not require obedience to authority that contradicts justice. The vows I once took were not broken by escape, they were fulfilled by survival, compassion, and the refusal to let silence win. Obedience, I have learned, belongs not to institutions, but to conscience, to that inner voice that recognizes right from wrong even when power insists otherwise. There were years when I was angry at God, convinced that faith itself had betrayed me, but time revealed something gentler and far more demanding, that God was never in the walls that imprisoned us, but in the hands that helped us escape, in the strangers who offered safety without questions, and in the strength we discovered within ourselves when no one else would save us. Pain, I now know, can either destroy us or teach us, but it is faith, questioned and refined, that sustains us through the darkest nights. When I walk through the gardens of the center and see women laughing softly where fear once ruled, I understand that justice is not only about punishment, it is about restoration, about ensuring that suffering is not the end of the story. Father Michael's power ended not when he lost his title, but when his silence was replaced by truth. And that is a lesson I wish I had learned earlier, but one I am grateful to carry now. My sister Sarah, once the youngest and most frightened among us, now a grandmother surrounded by love, often tells me that escaping that night gave her a future she never thought possible. And in her words, I find confirmation that survival itself can become legacy. If there is one message I hope my story leaves behind, it is this: never let anyone convince you that silence is holiness, that endurance is virtue, or that questioning authority is betrayal. Silence protects the oppressor, never the wounded. Your voice, even when it trembles, carries power beyond measure, and it is never too late to speak, never too late to seek justice, and never too late to rebuild a life shaped by truth rather than fear. I lived in silence for 28 years, believing it was the price of survival, but when I finally spoke, I discovered that truth does more than free the one who tells it. It creates pathways for others to follow. If you are listening to this story and recognize even a fragment of your own experience within it, know this: you are not alone, you are not weak, and you are not wrong for wanting safety, dignity, and truth. Healing does not require perfection, only courage, and courage often begins with a single whispered truth. Thank you for listening, for believing, and for carrying this story forward, because every voice that refuses silence makes the world a little safer for those who cannot yet speak.